So, a second ago we had the conversation about, how much healthcare would cost, what it would look like to the average person, and the idea that at the very least, we would kind of wind up with a break-even point, right?
Yeah.
But that's the starting point, in theory. One of the things that we have to discuss, is the idea that once we start moving towards, single payer and nationalized healthcare, we have a real opportunity to actually cut costs. I think it's estimated that, doctors spend like 15% of their time on paperwork and things like that for billing.
Okay.
On a per doctor scale, the number that I saw was it can range from $68,000 to $85,000 per year.
Okay.
Just doing paperwork. So once you streamline that, there's a huge opportunity for savings, per doctor. And like the great thing about that is if they're spending 14 to 15% of their time, just doing paperwork, once you cut that back down, you now have more opportunities for people to actually be seen by a doctor,
yeah.
right? Because the horror story you always hear from people, oh, we can't go to nationalized healthcare because then people will be waiting forever to get seen and blah, blah, we'd have long lines and everything. Well, yeah, but if we're actually giving a doctor an extra 10 to 15% of time to spend with patients, that kind of knocks that theory down. So we have that in terms of time. We have we have the opportunity for savings in terms of billing. But the next thing that we would look at is negotiating prices. And I'm up. I'll be right back.
Oh. Okay.
There was a great thing, I think last week, a couple of weeks ago, where AOC was talking to a pharmaceutical exec, right?
Yeah.
And they were talking about the price of specifically HIV medications,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, you would think that there would be differences. We know that there's differences in cost for medication across United States and Canadian border, United States and Mexican border. She was kind of talking about Australia, which is half the world away. I think literally, but one of the interesting things that she mentioned on there was that the monthly cost of HIV medication in the United States for a particular drug was $1,800 a month,
yeah.
right? Which is seemingly obscene. And it becomes even more so when you consider that the cost for that drug in Australia is $8 a month.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And it's like the big question is, why? Is it,
Well, I think what the rep came back and said was that it's because the drug is still under patent in the United States, and it's not in the rest of the globe, so they can sell it as a generic.
And that's kind of a weird thing, right? So there's not a patent anymore in Australia, and there is a patent here. And you would expect for there to be a difference, right? So if a drug is $8 in Australia, and we have to deal with the patent in the United States, you go, okay, I would see that drug then being $16, maybe $24.
Yeah.
Hey, I'd even go so high as maybe $50. If we went 10 times, it would be $80. So, but the divide between $8 and $1,800 is
insane.
It is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A patent made that much of a difference, right?
Yeah.
So this may be something I'm not correct on, so you might have to fact check me, but didn't Jonas Salk, who created the polio vaccine, he didn't have a patent, right?
Right, he did.
Yeah.
And there's this, oh, that guy's ball just jumped out of the gutter and back in, and he picked up the spare. Sorry. But yes, back to Jonas Salk.
Okay.
We are bowling. Anyway, back to Jonas Salk. It's an interesting thing because when he was asked about why he didn't patent the polio vaccine,
yeah.
his answer was, well, you can't patent the sun, right? And the idea was that he created this whole thing that was supposed to be for the betterment of humanity. How can you patent it?
Yeah.
I think, like, if we're going to talk about patents and everything, especially we're talking about a medication that has the ability to save countless lives, I'd kind of like to draw it back to to Alexander Fleming, right?
Okay.
Are you familiar with him?
Rings a bell.
Okay, so Alexander Fleming was the guy who developed penicillin,
Okay.
right, by accident. But one of the interesting things about him was he did have a patent, right?
Yeah.
What he wound up doing with that patent was actually turning it over to the governments of the UK and the United States, and this coincides with with the war, and he wanted to make sure that basically lives were saved. But it's an interesting thing, when you consider that. That's a nice little side chat. Now, we're not being anti-patent, and we're not saying that people shouldn't have patents on the things that they develop, especially if it's a monumental thing, because people should be able to earn a living. But when we talk about negotiation, one of the problems that we have right now with negotiation, especially with big pharma, is that we don't do it right now. We should. But there's a lot of cases where when you're negotiating, whether or not you have a successful negotiation is based on whether or not a party is willing to walk away from the table,
Okay.
right?
So, can we talk about what does happen if a company has sole rights to a patent on a drug,
So,
or what we would do in that case?
and that's a good question, right? And I have an idea on that. It's a little bit radical,
Okay.
but let's establish some things that we need to go. Like we have a company that has the sole rights in the United States to a drug that helps people with HIV, right?
Yeah.
A couple of years ago when we had Pharmabro, I remember that guy.
Martin Shkreli.
Martin Shkreli.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for I believe wasn't it the EpiPen, like that he drove prices up or something like that?
Yeah, it was a version of the EpiPen.
Yeah, a version of the EpiPen, and it was like the cost was like something like $700 a month, or no, $700 a dose or something like that at that point. And that is an extremely dangerous thing, right? Because I don't know if you've ever had allergies or anything like that, or you have, and when we talk about the EpiPen, it's for an extreme allergy, especially if you're a parent and you have a child who has that. It's a very scary idea, the idea that you wouldn't be able to afford this thing that could make its way into your child's food, right? So, back to what I was going to say. When we talk about companies that have an exclusivity on a drug, and the idea that we would have to negotiate with them and that we have no leverage when it comes to those cases, there is a legal precedent for negotiation here, and now we're used to seeing it in other situations, and I would say that we could use eminent domain on that.
Okay.
And for those watching, who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, eminent domain is kind of the fight that we're having with the border wall, right? Like they use eminent domain for a border wall. In essence, they're taking over other people's land, and what you do in the process is you offer somebody a settlement, that's kind of worth what the land is worth.
Yeah.
You can actually do that with medications, right? If it is deemed something that's necessary to public health, you can actually use eminent domain. Do I think we would actually have to do that? No, it's a nuclear option. But it is something that should be used when we're discussing negotiation with companies that have an exclusivity on a medication that is, life-saving, or the lack of which is life-threatening for people.
Okay.
And I think that's something that, as a congressperson, I would push for in terms of having that leverage to make sure that we're bringing down costs. And I don't hear anybody talking about that. It's a little bit of a radical idea, but I think when we're talking about saving lives and making this accessible to people, we have to have radical ideas.
Okay.
And you're up.